I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers at Columbia, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here. It's a special privilege to welcome Her Highness Princess Reem Al Ali, and she is a famous, of course, alumni of the School of Journalism at Columbia University and the founder of the Jordan Media Institute. And regularly attends some of the events here at the center. So she is a regular, even though today you made it onto the second floor of the building, as you were saying. So it's great to have you, Your Royal Highness. It really is. And it's wonderful to also welcome Bruce Shapiro, a colleague. This represents the first collaboration with the Dart Center at the School of Journalism. I'm delighted also that independently of this, Bruce has recently kindly accepted to join the Faculty Steering Committee for the Global Center in Amman. And so it's wonderful that you have this first-hand experience now with this center.
Now I know what I'm in for.
Now you know what you're in for, exactly, and you can speak about it and you can help guide it. For those of you who don't know, Columbia has a network of 9 global centers around the world. This was the first that was established, and in 2 months we will mark our 10-year anniversary. It was opened in March 2019, and since that time we've opened centers in Beijing, Mumbai, Nairobi, Paris, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago, and now we have a small center also in Tunis. So this is really I always refer to the Amman Center as the jewel in the crown. It has really set the standard for the global centers. The global centers are Colombia's answer or attempted answer to the question of globalization and how that differs from internationalization, which defined higher education in the second half of the 20th century. It was a very different time at that time. The State Department, through Article 6, for example, invested in creating area studies programs and regional institutes at all top universities. And at Columbia, we have the Weatherhead Institute for East Asian Studies, the Harriman Institute for Russian Studies, and Institute for Latin American Studies, and so on and so forth. The purpose was to really understand different parts of the world. The problem was that we sat in New York, mostly white men, learning about those different parts of the world. China and the former Soviet Union, of course, were of particular interest. And one could spend her entire career studying China without ever having stepped foot in Africa. The world has changed considerably, starting about 30 years ago with technology, with ease of movement. The world has become much flatter. I always like to refer to the refugee crisis that we face today, which is very much on the table in terms of what you're discussing over the next 3 days, the Syrian refugee problem compared to the Palestinian refugee problem of 50 and 70 years ago. That was a very regional question in that refugees spread around the surrounding area in Syria, Lebanon, and for the most part in Jordan. When you look at the Syrian refugee crisis today, it's a global crisis, and Syrian refugees have knocked on the doors for aid in Australia and in Canada and in many places in between. Ebola, for example, there's an outbreak in West Africa. It's no longer a West African problem. It becomes a global problem overnight. So the global centers are really meant to get our faculty and students out into the world, to engage in the world, and to learn and collaborate and do the kinds of things that you'll be doing here over the next 3 days in a way that would be almost impossible to replicate on the Morningside campus in New York. So we're here, Bruce and Sarah and everybody who's here is here to learn with you and to learn from you and to bring the knowledge that they have to complement knowledge that they will be gaining here over the next few days. And that really is the whole idea behind the global centers, to facilitate that and to provide a global context so that what we study in Amman is informed by what we study in Rio de Janeiro, which informs what we look at in Mumbai, and so on and so forth. And again, Her Highness Princess Reem has been a key partner. We've worked with the Jordan Media Institute, and having the Columbia Center in Amman benefits tremendously from relationships with people such as yourself and with institutions that you've built, and we hope vice versa. Jordan, as all of you know, is one of the top 10 refugee hosting countries in the world. And there are many different numbers for refugees, I've been learning. So refugees account for about 25 million people in the world. But when you look at forced migration, you're talking about 60 million. When you talk about migration more globally, then we're talking about 250 million, so different sort of orders of magnitude. The 25 million refugees do not include the internally displaced people. And in the case of Syria, today we have more than 13 million people. 13 out of the 30 million original population of Syria are displaced within Syria. Out of the 25.3 million refugees across the world, about half of them, 12.5 million, are here in this region. Okay, so imagine that half of the world's refugees are in this region. About 5 million of them are from Syria, from the recent crisis. Another 5 million are Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency. And out of those 25 million refugees, out of the 12.5 million refugees, 5.5 are children. 5.5 million are children. When we look at internally displaced people in Syria, out of the 13.4 million internally displaced people in Syria, around 5.6, so slightly less than half of them are children. When you look at the demographics of this region also, the region has 37 million children under the age of 5. 37 million under the age of 5. So that's a bit more than 10% of the population of the region. 25% of them are at risk of not reaching their full development potential according to UNICEF. So I don't think that you could have picked a more important subject to focus on, how to upgrade the capacity of journalists around the world to deal with children and trauma in conflict zone. Creating gateways to understanding such complex crises and bring them to the attention of the world. We're delighted that there are 22 journalists, I think, from 16 countries that represents the Middle East, North Africa region, Australia, the European Union, and the United States. And I think that that's a testament to the great work that has gone behind this, but also to the importance of the subject matter at hand. I know we have a busy schedule, and we're all looking forward to hearing Her Royal Highness Princess Reem speak to us. So with that brief introduction, again, I want to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you and turn the floor over to Bruce, who will introduce Her Highness. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Safwan.
Thank you.
I should say that, yes, as Safwan said, the core of the room are 22 journalists from 16 countries who are here together for the next 4 days to talk about covering children in the Syrian refugee crisis. But we are also honored and pleased to have a number of the experts in science and policy and journalism who are on the program's faculty in the room, and some other friends of this community. This is a slightly bigger gathering. I'm going to say a few things to frame this evening a little bit and introduce Her Royal Highness. Then we'll have a little bit of a conversation with the room, and then we break for a festive reception. So this should be an interesting meeting, but not too demanding one, I hope. I do want to start by thanking Safwan and the entire Global Center's Amman staff who have been heroic in putting this thing together over the last couple of months. It has taken a lot to get you all into the room, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes facilitation, both within this building and outside of it, for which we're very grateful. all of the journalists who are here, all of you who are reporters, have immersed yourselves in what may seem to be an impossible story. And Safwan, you mentioned the global scale of the refugee crisis. It's at once too big and sweeping and too intimate. It's overwhelming. The refugee crisis is overwhelming for a journalist in the degree of violence, the scale of flight, the epic journeys of individuals and families and communities, and the impact on so many millions of people in this region and around the world, and the rippling political effects beyond that. And at the same time, for reporters, for visual journalists as well, the story is daunting in its particularity, reporting on people who are without status, without state, without power, who bring an infinite variety of individual stories. It means reporting on the biological, the psychological, the social impact of these overwhelming events. And when the subject is children, the challenge grows even more. The journalists who were here earlier discussing the particular challenges that they themselves have faced. And when we're reporting on children, we're reporting on the most powerless of the powerless. We are reporting not just on an evolving crisis, but on developing minds. We are here as reporters because while the Syria refugee crisis is an immediate present tense story, reporters in this room know that the news doesn't end when families get resettled or even when the fighting stops. The scientists who are here will tell us that the story, the news, is really just beginning, that the story will continue to unfold as today's refugee children grow and learn and mature and enter adult life. And it's up to us as reporters to cover that. We're here because in reporting stories of children, because reporting stories of children in the refugee crisis means really telling three stories of past upheavals and traumas, which refugees have left behind. It means a story of uncertainty and dispossession in the present moment, but it also means a story about the future. It's not just a story of tragedy, but of pathways to reasserting a basic social contract and of recognizing and ratifying resilience and possibility. We are here as reporters because we need to learn from a revolutionary generation of scientists and clinicians who've defined the profound dangers posed by overwhelming stress and deprivation in the first years of life, but who have also defined approaches and policies and interventions that make a difference, which foster resilience, which encourage learning, which stabilize families, which literally create the future for children for whom the future so recently seemed at best a long bet. That's your reporting here. You're not just conveying the reality of the present, but creating the future by educating news consumers and societies and leaders, indeed by empowering refugees and their families and their children themselves through your reporting. This kind of work challenges us as journalists in a profound way. These stories challenge our knowledge about science and the brain and child development and a host of policies and all kinds of things. These stories challenge our technical toolkit. How do we interview? How do we photograph? How do we narrate? They challenge our ethical compass, and they may challenge us emotionally and morally. Some of us may feel a personal connection to refugees' experience. I, for example, speak to you today as a grandchild of a child refugee. And all of us are tested at times by the horrors recounted to us, by the desperation and violence we may witness directly, and we may wonder at times if our reporting and the stories we hear and transmit is making a difference. For the next 3 days, we will be talking about how to meet this challenge. We'll be hearing from scientists and policy experts. We will be talking journalist to journalists. I will have a number of thank yous to give later about what made this possible, but we'll do that at the reception. For now, I want to bring us to kind of the first installment in this conversation, which is the honor that we feel to be addressed by Her Royal Highness Princess Reem Ali, who is here on the one hand carrying the official burden of being Her Royal Highness Princess Reem Ali, but who is here first and foremost as a colleague. She had a distinguished career working for CNN in the Baghdad Bureau, for the BBC, for many other broadcasters. She is the founder of the Jordan Media Institute, which it was my great pleasure to tour this morning. When we talk about globalization and its impact, one of the untold stories of globalization is one of the great stories of the last decade is the globalization of journalism training, and Jordan Media Institute is part of that, bringing, for the first time in history, international standards in reporting, in ethics, in technique to journalists in this region, as other nonprofit organizations are doing around the world. This is in itself a wonderful answer to the crisis of the times. With that, I'm going to shut up and turn the microphone over to our colleague and Her Royal Highness Princess Reem Ali, and then we'll have a conversation.
It's a hard act to follow, Bruce. Just a few minutes and already so many avenues you've opened. Thank you. So I'd like to just start by welcoming everybody, also to Amman, in particular Bruce Shapiro, who manages the Dart Center for Journalism, and also because of your relationship with Columbia University. And I do have to mention that we have a common link with a common friend who was my professor at Columbia, David Claytel, who was also my mentor in journalism education, and who helped me set up the Jordan Media Institute. So I'm very grateful that you reached out to me, not just because this is a subject of huge proportion. I'm very often asked, do you miss being a journalist? And my reply is invariably, I'm still involved through my students, but there are some stories that I wish that I would have liked to cover, and definitely the refugee story is one I feel very passionate about. So thank you. Safwan, thank you so much for a very kind and generous introduction. It's always a pleasure working with the Columbia Center and with you. Thank you for making the time. I know you have other obligations, but it's very kind of you to be here today. And also, obviously, I think we're very grateful to the sponsors of this event for not only understanding why trauma in refugee children matters, but also for doing something about it. And that's also why everybody is here, and that's why you're all reporters at the end of the day, and we'll come back to that maybe later. So thank you all for being here, whether you be from Jordan or anywhere in the world, and for making the time to listen to my remarks. Charles Dickens, as we all know, was a journalist as well as a novelist in the 19th century, and as writers do, he used storytelling to convey messages. And most of his novels denounced the ill treatment of children in Victorian England and the need to provide them all with a proper education. The most powerful of these messages, some of you may be familiar with, of course, was in his book, The Christmas Carol, when the main character is shown the figure of a creature wearing a robe, and within the robes are two children who are sort of very emaciated. And when Scrooge, the main character, asks who they are, the reply is, "They are man's. The boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both and of all their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. It's striking that this was a cautionary tale written more than 100 years ago, but I'm sure many of you here must have seen images in the media, or maybe sometimes reported some, that are evocative of these descriptions of deprived children. In the 1980s, of course, there was the famine in Ethiopia. After that, the media in the 90s showed everyone what ethnic cleansing in the Balkans looked like, almost live on air. Today, we do see Syrian refugee children in the media, again, largely to the efforts of many of you here. But they have to compete for airtime or for space with so many other children in need. The difference is that following the famine in Ethiopia, there was huge mobilization, Live Aid and many more. The war in Bosnia and Kosovo triggered huge campaigns that led to support and sympathy the world over. For Syrian children, the window of sympathy seems to have remained open for a very short moment, only to be closed in some areas of the world by fear-mongering and the stigma that comes with being a refugee in today's world. It's not to say, of course, that the United Nations agencies and NGOs have not rushed to support them. It's not to say that there hasn't been coverage. There have been also local NGOs that do admirable work. And most of the well-known international humanitarian NGOs, everybody's here. A few days ago, I even met a team from Sesame Street, and their workshop has been helping Syrian children deal with trauma in camps more specifically. But the challenge that Syrian children face today is twofold. Generally speaking, there does seem to be less mobilization globally, and part of it may come from how the media has changed. We'll come to that as well later. The other challenge is that their scars are invisible. Children do not have to look malnourished or physically injured to be in danger. Their trauma doesn't always show on their faces or on their bodies. And that's where journalists have a duty to make sure the public knows that children like Syrian refugee children are human beings in danger, even once they found temporary relief from conflict, and that saving them means taking care of their physical and mental well-being, which in turn, of course, means taking care of our future as human beings. Trauma, of course, and you know this probably better than I, trauma stems from all that refugee children have seen, the risks they face, those journeys that you described, Bruce, because they're vulnerable, particularly when they're out of school. Isolation, discrimination, different forms of exploitation, and there's poverty, which could also be considered as an act of violence against children. And the result of all this is toxic stress. And some experts say that what Syrian children have witnessed, in fact, goes beyond the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. But you are all media people here. You don't have to take my word for this. You can do your research, because at the end of the day, that's really what it takes to make your stories more powerful, more likely to lead to action. Research, a bit more time spent talking with people around children, and maybe more importantly, with children themselves, making sure you respect ethical rules inherent to dealing with minors. Ask yourselves, and then ask your readers, viewers, listeners, consumers on social media. And Safwan gave us amazing figures that are really important to bear in mind. How many Syrian children today have ever known a world without war, poverty, and conflict? Does anybody know, by the way, what that figure is? Zero? Okay. The answer, according to reports, about 3 million children have actually never known a world without war, poverty, and conflict. That's roughly the population of Amman. Amsterdam has 800,000 people. So there are almost 4 times more Syrian children who've never known peace than there are people living in Amsterdam. It helps to give perspective to facts. Today, of course, we have so much more means at our fingertips, and one would think that it would allow for powerful messages aimed at triggering public responses to help children overcome their ordeals in much better ways than in Victorian England, for example. But recently, it seems that all these new developments haven't really moved a global public to action at the scale that is needed. And yet, one of journalism's most valuable roles is to mobilize public awareness when it comes to humanitarian issues. Like you, there are many young journalists in Jordan and in our region with a thirst for doing the right thing, and who understand that their profession is important for its role in society. I see them here, I see them at JMI, and I know it sounds obvious. It actually isn't, because there's also so much confusion over the role of the media versus the role of entertainment, infotainment, social media, all putting their 2 cents worth of comments on various topics. And so, contrary to what many thought might happen with the advent of technology that allowed so much direct public participation, we in fact do need you. We need proper, ethical, investigative-based journalism today more than ever. And we need it precisely because it can help us make sense of what the issues really are through simple, fact-based storytelling. Of course, more data-oriented journalism can also make a difference in this new world where opinion, rumor, false assertions supporting specific agendas appear in our letterboxes and on our social media sites, posing as accurate news reports. But not only. With the right support and with the right kind of ethics, children's voices can be brought to the forefront. To begin with, mainstream media hasn't completely disappeared yet. According to the Anna Lindh Intercultural Trends Report of 2018, and I would really encourage you, it's online, I would encourage you to take a look at that. In European countries and in southern Mediterranean countries, TV still reigns as the most trusted media source. This is followed in part by print in European countries, films and documentaries, which, by the way, have been much more successful, it seems, in telling the story, in the way they tell the story, the Syrian refugee story at any rate, than online media, books, radio, and social media. In the southern Mediterranean, TV is followed immediately by online media, then social media, then print, radio, and books, and films and documentaries are almost last. So if we look at mainstream media, it's not to say that nothing has been done. A lot has been done. British daily The Independent, for example, has not only provided coverage of Syrian refugees, it also actually set up a twinning scheme with the NGO Wall Child. And that allowed children from the Zaatari camp to correspond with children in the UK, sharing stories, discussing various topics, carrying out art projects together. It's a project called Voice More. One of the young participants, Hanin, from the War Child schoolroom in Zaatari, told the Independent newspaper, "It has inspired me to change and challenge stereotypes to make a better kind of journalism." Hanin is 16 years old, lives in a refugee camp, and she knows that there can be a better kind of journalism. The UNICEF slogan, "Children under attack," rightly points to what happens when children are not looked after. We could take it one step further, and that headline could be "Our Future Under Attack." Some media did cover the drastic cut in support that led to the reduction of hundreds of teachers from UNICEF in Syrian refugee camps last year. But how long did the outrage last? And how much more support can really be raised in harnessing the media? And the same goes, by the way, for UNRWA, when its funding was cut off. UNICEF talks about working to prevent these children from becoming a lost generation. I'm not sure whether it's not too late for some of them. Emotional support for displaced children is not considered part of emergency responses to conflict. But without it, there can be devastating consequences for our societies. And maybe you all here have a role to play in pushing for more of that. After the fall of ISIS, Time magazine had a cover about the children of Daesh, asking precisely the only question that needed to be asked about children who have lived through such trauma and atrocities. These children, some of them child soldiers, deserve a second chance. But wherever they are in the world, how do we make sure that that chance is offered? How do we turn a perceived burden into an obvious to me, opportunity? Whatever the tool, it's the quality of reporting and storytelling that can help lead to action. Often this is done through shocking stories and images. This is a good picture, by the way. The danger, of course, is that readers and viewers become desensitized. Research shows that the public will respond to stories where they feel they might have some control. Stories of an individual or a family rather than thousands of people, for example. The picture of the Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, drowned on a beach in Greece, was worth hundreds of articles on refugees fleeing by the sea. So this emphasizes the need to tell stories of individuals and not to only rely on figures and data. There's already a lot of decent reporting that goes over the same ground of conditions for displaced people or refugees. But we need much more coverage of places that people are leaving, as Bruce pointed out, or have left, to explain why they're leaving, how this can affect them for life, rather than just the camps in which they end up. There might also be a need for more critical reporting or maybe questions asked of the aid agencies, no matter what an amazing job they do, how much funding could really be allocated to dealing with trauma in displaced children. The big problem that I see in many cases isn't though so much the lack of specialized knowledge in reporting on vulnerable children, because that can be gained by effort and by research. I think sometimes there's a lot of work to be done on professional journalistic standards in general. And as you kindly pointed out, that's what we do or try to do at JMI, and that's what I know you've been doing at the Dart Center. Covering Syrian refugee children calls on journalists, of course, to observe specific rules, and it's tricky. You need to have empathy, of course. It's a requirement for any good journalist. But media people need to be aware of child protection concerns. At the same time, refugee officials need to be aware that without these specific stories and images of children or conversations with children, where appropriate, a lot of these issues will never come to light. Photographers posing children, sometimes in potentially dangerous situations, journalists who don't speak the language or don't have proper translation. The problem is that particularly in covering refugees and internally displaced people, there are very few checks and very few consequences if things are being reported wrong. Refugees are not going to sue, and they'll probably never see the story. Raising awareness on the traumas caused by the situation of these children requires journalists to really seek more information about the science behind the issues that these children, and therefore those around them, will almost inevitably face as a result of conflict. The most compelling stories also are those found just by going out and talking to people in communities. Journalists can and should look for stories in many more places than they do now, because most internally displaced people and refugees are not in camps. So there's a couple of thoughts or questions I'd like to leave you with, and it might be something to think about in the next few days. When I started researching and talking with some media experts about this topic, one thing came to my mind. How can we harness the power of new media or social media to mobilize the public and raise more awareness on this topic? Because you see, in a way, traditional media like TV, radio, print, it can put these humanitarian issues in the public's face, and that's a good thing. But when the issue is put on air forcefully like that, whether you like it or not, whether they like it or not, no one can plead ignorance over the consequences that we all face if nothing is done now to help Syrian children, refugees, deal with their situation, with their traumas. The challenge with social media becomes to make sure that these stories are impossible to ignore, because they're a bit like silos. You go to the site that you want to like-minded people are following. So the interactive character of social media, and now many newsrooms are now moving towards these models, in fact makes it very easy to miss these stories. You can choose what you want to see. You can choose not to be affected by disturbing images, and you can spend a lifetime not even knowing some simple truths. I found amazing stories on the UNHCR's website, but I looked for them. What if I hadn't actively searched for them? Can the big groups, Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, and others, be pressured into devoting space on their social media platforms specifically for humanitarian causes such as this one? Is it unrealistic to expect them to place links or stories that are impossible to miss on their platforms? It's very fitting that the Dart Center's first workshop in the Middle East is being held in Amman, where so many refugees have come through in need of help and needing to be heard. So I'm very grateful that you're here for conducting your valuable work here. But many of us went into journalism because we believed that it wasn't enough to watch without doing anything. As journalists, we are taught that our storytelling has the power to bring change. So here's my second thought. We're taught that journalism is a first draft of history. And until roughly the last 3 decades, one might argue that technology didn't allow for information to circulate as fast and as graphically as it does today, which is why I feel that it can be shocking to think that our better informed societies are witnessing things happening before their very eyes that were once condemned by history with a capital H. I'm referring to what we're witnessing in Syria, but also in Palestine, in Yemen, in Myanmar, and now in camps in the US where children are separated from their parents. So does this mean that the media today is so diluted, so insignificant, drowned by the multiplication of voices, that there is no compass pointing to or reminding us what it is to be a human being? How many more pictures of starving children, or children stranded on European or Malay beaches, or children separated from their parents will it take for people to realize that trauma, in those who will be our next generation, no matter where they are in the world, or how that trauma happened, cannot beget a healthy society? And at the same time, this forced migration, as you both pointed out, looks like a phenomenon that's becoming entrenched. So we need to look at the way refugees who've now been in countries like Jordan for years are changing the societies around them, economically, politically, socially, culturally. It's an enrichment. It's not a burden, as some people keep repeating. Media needs expression, it needs depth that will motivate and lead to action, and most of all, it's a question of values. So I'll just conclude by quoting Albert Einstein, who said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything." Thank you all for being here and for doing something.
I'll start out by asking a few things, but then we'll open up the conversation to the room, because that's really, why we're here. And also, I would remind folks in the audience that you can speak in either English or Arabic, because we do have simultaneous translation going on. Just if one of you starts to speak in Arabic, slow down enough for me to put on my headset. That's all I would ask. Let me start out by asking you to think about two phases of your journalism career and things that you may have learned or think about that relate to this question of covering the refugee crisis and covering children in particular. On the one hand, you were primarily an international correspondent working for big global news organizations. You were working for big international news organizations for CNN. At JMI now, you are training journalists, some of whom go to work for international organizations, but many of whom are building local journalism here in Jordan and elsewhere in the region. On this issue, how do you think about the sort of the job of the local journalist and the local news organization versus the international one? How do they relate? How are they the same? How are they different? How do they relate to one another?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind when you put that is obviously it's a question of audience. But even at CNN, in an international, you've got your US audience, your Europe, Africa. I mean, it's time zones, actually, more than anything else. So you do, you know that for an American audience, you have to say everything in 1.5 minutes. International, usually, rest of the world, you have 1 minute more, but just. And of course, some things, I suppose, I mean, I can talk about my experience, which was mainly in Baghdad at that stage. Of course, American audiences will talk about their soldiers. They're concerned about their soldiers. But then you look at and European to a degree, but then you do Middle East and Asia, and, you find yourself being asked questions by the anchors in those bureaus more about what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, you have to really strike a balance. What we're teaching at JMI, obviously, when it comes to standards are standards. Doesn't matter where you are. And I really, it's something that I really try to impress as much as I can. And at the risk of sounding a little bit arrogant, I mean, I was shown once, and I know it was done with all good faith, a program that was done for journalists in the third world, and I'm sure they took into account certain economic conditions and not just, but I resent that. I think that a journalist is a journalist, and a journalist's standards should be the same no matter what. Of course, the audience is different. So if you're Jordanian and you're reporting on the refugee issue, and you cannot, you cannot ignore this if you're a journalist in Jordan. This is part of our lives. It's in the newspaper headlines. It's on social media. And I think there's a huge need to constantly bring facts to this story. I don't like to say this, but we have seen very disparaging headlines about prices going up because of refugees, or things that happen and it's all the refugees' fault. Well, there needs to be a bit of a more of an analysis and more in-depth research and frankly correction of these assertions that are sort of done a little bit sometimes politically, sometimes without thought. And so there needs to be a lot of, but again, I think essentially, yes, you're talking to an audience that's local, that has its concerns. Yes, people will be asking, well, how is this going to affect us? How is this going to affect our economy, our children in school, our hospitals, our healthcare? And it's just a matter of really bringing the right information. Because the truth is actually much more scary than it seems, or that it's made to look like. And again, that is really the duty that everybody has, in Jordan as in elsewhere, I think.
Let me also ask you about this question that you raised about the role of the journalist in accountability for agencies and also for governments, right? You're in this region and you see the best that agencies can do and the best that governments can do, and also the places that they fall down. Where do you think reporting has been helpful and successful? What do you think have been either blind spots or areas where there might be more scrutiny in this refugee realm?
Well, I definitely think that, like in some places in Europe as well, the language used, let's start by what has not been, what I think could have been done better. I mean, the language used, I think there needs to be much more rigor in the words and the vocabulary that's used when we talk about these issues. And again, Jordan is not different than other countries. You remember maybe in Great Britain, even before the so-called, I don't like referring to the word crisis, but I mean, let's say the refugee issue, when there were Romanians immigrating in great numbers to England, the words in the British tabloids was, what was it, waves of refugees, or refugees flooding in, pouring in. I mean, I think a little bit more thought can be given to the vocabulary that is used when we do that. And I think I've seen things in Jordan. I believe actually, because JMI a couple of years ago organized a conference about covering Syrian refugees. And all of a sudden, we had a great number of officials who showed up, who gave figures that I had never seen in the media about how much healthcare was being provided exactly to refugees, whether or not it affected what budget. So I think there's original sins on both sides in a way. The media, I think, might be a little bit more pushy with demanding questions, figures, going to the next official if one official is a bit tight-lipped, and I know that it happens a lot. We're all aware of of the realities of being a reporter in our part of the world. There's a tradition, that still is maybe lacking in some areas. And I think on the part of government and officials, there really needs to be, much more effort into understanding that this is, this official from the Ministry of Health came up, and I would have been proud to announce all these figures. I don't know why these figures were not out before. I was stunned. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's a treasure trove of, it showed actually something that the government was dealing in the refugees as best it could, with a very good ethic actually and thinking behind it when it came to vaccines for children. A lot of things had been thought out. And in a way that they were trying to do this obviously without affecting the healthcare of Jordanians, who were very concerned about how this would be spread out at the time. And I'm talking, this was several years ago. I'm not sure how things have, anything has. But it's a shame. I mean, I really think just a bit more communication. And we're journalists. Communication is supposedly what we do. We probably need to be a bit more pushy sometimes.
At the risk of crossing some boundary, you're also a parent now, which is, I think, different from when you were reporting in Baghdad. As a parent, when we think about ethical reporting on children, what do you wish you had had in your toolkit that maybe are things you think about now as a parent? How do you think reporters should be approaching children who are legitimately part of stories and whose stories need to be told?
I definitely think, I mean, a lot of the actual ethics of speaking to children and the specific rules that apply to speaking with children and putting them or interviewing them, it's actually really quite a world of its own. And so I have to say that this is something that I think should be offered much more systematically. It shouldn't be a specialized training, frankly, because these are situations you're likely to encounter everywhere else. I have to say also, being a parent and looking back, it's a very difficult thing to see what children are going through, and at the same time, your reflex is to protect children from the media in certain ways. I mean, I get upset if my husband puts our children on Facebook. So I have to admit, that part's of the record. But I mean, I have to admit, I'm extremely overprotective when it comes to that. That said, there is huge power and value in letting children speak. I know that when I did the research about before talking here, some of the UN agencies were saying that they felt that sometimes reporters didn't speak enough to children or with children. Children are spoken above their heads a lot, or spoken of, but not really with. And you don't have to put them on air, but just I think if there's rules about that, which there are most of the time, but just having a feel of what it's like. Somebody did a very interesting documentary. I think it was a Norwegian documentary, and the entire documentary is seen by a child and filmed. You've seen, yeah? And so that really, again, helps put things in perspective. Let's use the technology that we have in this way. There's a lot that can be done, I think. Amazing stories, amazing ways of really telling that story, of putting parents also, because anyone can relate to a mom or a dad that is in pain. I mean, I saw at the time Iraqis who had to leave, and because I didn't have children at the time, I wondered, I was saying, well, no, try and stay. Why do you have to resettle? And for them, it was a no-brainer. Yeah. The safety and well-being and just mental well-being. My children don't have to go to school worrying about having encountering an ID or a bomb or just that. And now, of course, I can appreciate that we live in a country where we can send our kids to school without worrying about these things. So it's very difficult, but empathy is very important. And then, of course, there is the question that, I think whether you're a parent or not, one of the questions that I think is hard for journalists is you come across cases, you want to help them. And I don't think there's anything wrong with helping them as long as you separate the story from what you're doing. I mean, again, there's ethical rules about that, but I really think that at the end of the day, you're a human being. You can't sit and eat your lunch while you're doing your report and you've got 10 children looking at you. Obviously, and if you come across a story that's so compelling and you think that after that at one point you can help, then, why not? I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah. Let's go to the room. But my colleague Kelly there has the mic. And I would also ask Ariel, who's sitting in the back, to give me the high sign for time, because there's no clock visible from here. So when it's like 5 minutes away, let me know.
Good evening. Thank you for doing this. Can you tell me to what extent do you see parallels with the rise of populism in the West, with the refugee crises that you cited, as well as strategies you might suggest for pushing back against the rhetoric that they're a drain on resources and the demonization of refugees that's going on now?
Thank you for that. Actually, there is a huge correlation. The rise of populism and the way, and what I was saying, which is what it is to be a refugee in today's world, because of the rise of populism. And I think, unfortunately, we have, as human beings, a very short memory, or a very short collective memory. Which is, again, why I was saying I'm really shocked that all these memories of the Second World War, we were taught at school, never again. Well, what happened to that? And again, that's why I think the job of, and I don't want to over-dramatize, but really your duty is so much more important, because the history of humanity has been one of displacement of people, by the way. So people move. Populations, entire populations move. But I think there is still, in a lot of the reporting, we can do so much. There's a lot more that can be done. Fighting this populism trend means really getting into the figures, really sort of pushing these figures into people's faces by saying, well, no, this does not take away from your healthcare or from your free schooling, if in the countries where that exists, you know, it doesn't take away. But I mean, I've seen villages. Did you ever see this? Did you ever hear about this? There are villages in Italy that are empty, that are entire, that have been deserted. They are looking for people to buy houses for €1 in villages in Italy, and they tell you there's no space for refugees. Of course, there's a whole economic calculation to be made, and I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, something can be done. So it really just takes informing people, and relentlessly. The vocabulary, as I was saying, that is used, really rejecting these derogatory words, rejecting the notion that this person is here to take the food out of your child's mouth, because that's not the case. There is enough space for everybody. I mean, not to sort of, how can I say, sort of toot that horn, but I mean, if we can do it in Jordan with the GDP that we had, with the, you know, GDP that we have, I'm pretty sure it can be done in Europe, where there's, you know, a much higher standard of living and more wealth to go around. So again, it's figures, it's looking at data, looking again at stories, and I mean, look into the history of most people. Don't tell me that most people in Europe, some of whom are rejecting, you know, the people who are arriving now, didn't descend from someone who at one time in history came from somewhere else. And I think maybe we have to do a little more research there. The big fad now, by the way, is this whole ancestry. Yep. So, you know, encourage people to go on ancestry.com and see where their ancestors come, and whether or not they were welcome and how they were welcomed 3 generations ago to 100 years ago. There's so much that can be done with the tools that we have now. So let's use them to that advantage. I don't know if that answers, but I, in a way, I really think it's almost a battle. This whole populist streak, I'm sort of hoping it's a phase and it'll pass, but it is a battle that has to be fought, and the media has a huge role to play in that. Huge.
Sorry, do you want to go for? Okay. Her Royal Highness, thank you very much for speaking to us. It's very refreshing to have someone with your experience and now your position. Those two things combined. I thought it was very interesting that you said about giving voice to children, because I find that to be a big challenge because of the standards. I remember I found myself on board the Aquarius last year when the 630 refugees and migrants were not allowed to dock in Italy, and Malta also said they were not going to receive people, so we found ourselves for roughly 48 hours without having any idea what to tell those people who started to get very desperate about what was going to happen to them. The boat stopped, so they started thinking that they were going to be sent back to Libya. And I remember this very young man who was on board saying that he would rather die there, so he would jump. And there was a whole group of people that had to be put in place quickly to reassure him. He was 11 years old. He was traveling alone. And nothing will make me forget his face, but what hurt me the most was not to be able to put him on air.
No, that's a difficult one, because as he was alone, you couldn't go to anybody.
No, and he didn't have the legal right to give consent.
He didn't have the legal right to. That's so hard.
So and I knew that, obviously, I was there for 10 days, so we did eventually I told that story on air,
Yeah,
but it's
I was
just,
gonna
it
say,
doesn't
that's
have
the
the same impact.
It doesn't, yeah.
And so what is your advice because I still think it's so powerful when you have, obviously I'm not talking about exploiting children, I'm not talking about
but
asking some questions that are going to that children can't answer, but there is a way to talk to them and to let them tell their story in a very simple and childlike, infantile way that will create the empathy in people in Europe where governments are talking about an invasion, a wave, pouring refugees. It's like, we're not going to drown because these people are coming in. And yet we talk about them like that. And if you saw the face of that 11-year-old, you would never think that he would come and steal your job or your children's jobs or anything like that.
Of course.
Thank you.
I have to say that's a really, really hard challenge. I mean, the most I can think of now, but I know Jane will have better ideas than me tomorrow or whenever because she's still doing that activity. But the most I can think of, I mean, you did well to tell the story because that's one thing you can do. There's obviously views that you can take from a certain distance, from far, as long as you don't show his face. But maybe just the. I mean, what comes. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. If I was telling the story as a TV person, maybe the view that what he sees, and again, sort of. But that I just know in hindsight after having seen that Norwegian story. It's easy to say in hindsight because these are the cases that then make you think about what could I have done? What can I do next time? And I think you have to be so creative while still respecting. I mean, this is a particularly difficult one because anywhere else I would have just said, harass the parents and the refugee aid agency until you actually get permission to at least get a bit of something because I know it's sad to say and you don't want to exploit or manipulate, but this is also the truth. This is the truth of this child, and very often. The problem is the faces. When you don't have a face, it's so hard to relate to a story. So I'm sorry I can't answer it better than that, but well done for that.
Look, one of the reasons that we have pulled all of you together and for this meeting is to think about innovations in standards and innovations in storytelling that can get to this dilemma. Right. One thing I know about journalism history is that standards are constantly evolving in the presence of challenges that the standards did not foresee. So it may be even that out of this workshop, we come up with some ideas for how news practice needs to change to meet this challenge without at all turning in an exploitative or unethical direction. It's an interesting thing.
Yes, sorry. And if I may, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, maybe some new guidelines need to be put in place. I know, of course, one of the big fears with children is, and I've seen this happen with the TV stations I will not name, who actually put words into children's mouths, knowing that, they're not going to protest and it's going to go on air without anybody batting an eyelid. And so that's, I think, really, really one of the main. But if steering clear of that, and if this is, I think one would have to establish, this is the truth, and this is something that's happening. This is something so compelling. There was a film that was done in Sweden about people. I think it was reflecting a video that was made of people coming out of camps who arrived in Sweden, and they were looking at faces, but nobody knew their names. And then they made a film where they actually tried to find names for every single person. And that's a huge, huge challenge. It's putting this human face, giving a child a name, a history, something.
So we have time for 2 more questions. I would ask them in a focused way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for. It's me.
Yeah, تفضل.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation and your presence. I'm a Syrian psychiatrist, actually, who was a refugee in Jordan for 3 years, from 2012 to 14. And I would like to thank Jordan, actually, for hosting Syrian refugees and supporting them. and also supporting professionals in providing services for Syrians. I have two questions as a journalist, actually. First, can the journalist report about resilience of children and still get support for their cause? This is first question. The second, can we report or can we separate the reporting about crisis of children from the root causes of like political and all other situations that's around this? So can be done really? This is my two questions. Thank you very much.
I think if I understand correctly, so you're asking if you can both sort of support a cause and report on it. And I think for me, when it comes to humanitarian issues, it's a very simple equation in a way. There was it Terence who said that I'm a human and nothing that is human is foreign to me? I really, really think that, again, that's why one of the things I mentioned is we have to come back to values. And journalism is about values. Journalism is a little bit about, in a way, it's also about education. A journalist has a role as an educator, and they have a role as an educator to also, I suppose, promote or uphold humanistic values. So as such, it's not a matter, we're not talking about a political cause. I'm not supporting either side of the Syrian conflict. I'm actually just reporting on what's happening to children, because I believe that what happens to a fellow human being, especially at that age, should affect us all as human beings. And that's the story that I want people to see. I'm opening a window on the life of this family, this child, this person. It's one of the things we were often asked in Iraq, with the dictatorship at the time of Saddam Hussein, and how do you, well, I see it as we're opening a window in a place where people have no voice. And that's what journalism is about. It's about giving a voice to people who don't have the opportunity for that voice to come out. You know, the main rules in journalism is tell the truth and do no harm. And so as long as it doesn't go against that, I think I'm not sure I understand the second question about political issues. Obviously, I think politically, we were taught, and that was, if you remember, Dean Isaacson was very big on that, our dean at the journalism school. One of the first things he said was, you're a journalist, and theoretically, you shouldn't even vote or even have, that was, pushing it very, very far. But at the end of the day, you really have to, as a journalist, separate your politics, I believe. And again, for me, it's more about humanistic values. When it comes to politics, you cover politics, but you have to hear all sides. In politics, that's the rule. If you're a journalist, you really have to hear all sides and put both sides of there's always two sides to a story. But I do think that when it comes to humanitarian issues, it's not that there are not two sides to a story, but I mean, you have someone bombing and someone bombed, and.
Yeah. Let me just add one quick thing on this. On your question about resilience, I think, is it possible to give resilience the same urgency as sensational stories about carnage and mayhem and war? That's partly why this project exists, right? To figure out ways of communicating resilience through journalism just as much as we communicate about violence and sensation. It's a very important question that you ask.
Yeah, it is, and if I may, in our part of the world where, we've also unfortunately seen sometimes coverage that was a bit blown out of proportion, there's no need for that. Sadly, the truth is bad enough as it is. You really don't need to add clouds of smoke over a bombed building or to Photoshop. Trust me, it's. I don't like to say this, and I don't like the fact that it's true. But really, the truth is harsh enough as it is. You don't need to add to dramatize.
Rosie, last question.
Thank you. You talked quite a bit about the positive impact that visuals can have, whether that's television or photographs, and then also talked about the negatives of print, of text, of tabloids, etc., and the language that's used. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the positives of print, whether that's agencies, newspapers, or online, and whether you think that we can tell the story that we're talking about here in short version in the news story, or whether you think there's only really space within long form features, thousands of words to really explain what's going on here.
It's always a huge challenge, because these are stories that, you know, the stories of people are so compelling that, yes, you want them to be really all put out there in depth and go on for pages, and the most compelling, not the most compelling, but yes, the ones you see in magazines or in magazine form are always so powerful. But yes, we do live in a world where people don't always have that time, and especially when you look into today's social media, and whether it's sort of print online or whatever, people are going to skip through very quickly. So there's huge value in trying to put into also small words what is happening. And again, it can be very compelling. This is the huge challenge of journalists, by the way. It's much easier to go long, I think. It's much harder to go short and intense. It takes, I think, much more of an effort. And it's something but that is exactly what the challenge of journalists today is, probably more and more, because we talk about people's reduced attention span. There was always this debate also at journalism school about, you know, do you give the guy in Kansas sitting in his armchair what you think he wants, or do you give him, do you dumb down, do you not dumb down? I think you don't dumb down, but if you can say the exact same thing, or if you can say something close in a short way, why not, if it'll reach more people? But I don't think you dumb down in terms of content, because people are smart. I mean, you have to appeal to, again, the mind, the heart. But I think dumbing down is almost insulting, frankly. That's my personal view. But I think that, you know, you still have a margin of maneuver. It just takes a lot more work. It's really hard.
Well, I think that's as good a place as any to end. Thank you, Your Highness.